a cool October morning in 2011, on the outskirts of Millbrook, North Carolina, a 22-year-old named Caleb Whitfield pulled a borrowed Ford pickup around the back of his grandmother's property and started unloading broken boards, curved offcuts, and chunks of walnut and cherry left over from the factory where he worked. He hadn't called ahead. He just showed up, dropped the tailgate, and started stacking the wood near the old barn, while his grandmother, a 65-year-old woman named Odell Ferris, everybody called her Odie, watched from the porch and said nothing more than, "Leave it in the corner, out of the rain, up against the south wall." He did it again the following week, and the week after that. For the first few months, nobody in Millbrook paid much attention. Young men dumping scrap on a relative's land isn't news in a small town. But when Caleb's visits turned into a routine twice a month, then weekly, and the pile beside the barn grew into a wall over 6 feet high, the neighbors started asking questions. From the grocery store on Route 9 to the beauty parlor on Main Street, from Millbrook Baptist Church to the gas station, on the edge of town, the story traveled the way stories travel in small towns. And, as always happens, the details piled up along the way that Odie was letting her grandson use the farm as a factory dumping ground, that it would draw termites, that it was beneath a woman who'd spent 30 years teaching school, that Caleb was taking advantage of his grandmother because he didn't want to pay the disposal fee. Nobody in Millbrook could figure out why she allowed it. Her daughter, Caleb's mother, a woman named Renee who lived 40 minutes away, drove out to the farm one Sunday in the spring of 2012 to ask her mother directly. She found Odie in the yard, cataloging pieces of wood with chalk, a number on each piece copied into a lined notebook she carried under her arm. Renee watched for a moment, then asked, "Mom, what are you going to do with all of this?" Odie didn't stop writing. She just said, "I'm going to make something worth keeping." Renee looked at the pile, looked at the notebook, drove home, and later told her husband she thought her mother was getting a little strange in her old age. To understand why Odie Ferris did what she did with 12 years of scrap wood and a set of her late husband's tools, you have to go back further and understand who she was before that first truckload ever came through the gate. Odell Ferris was born in 1946 on a 44-hectare farm outside Millbrook that her family had worked for 3 generations. She graduated from a state teacher's college in 1967 and came straight back to teach at the town's elementary school, where she stayed for 31 years until she retired in 1998. In 1969, she married Wendell Ferris, a carpenter who'd learned the trade from his father, a man who ran a small shop building custom furniture for families in the area since the 1940s. Wendell wasn't a farmer by choice. He worked a small piece of land out of necessity and spent the rest of his time, the evenings, the weekends, the winters when the ground was too hard to touch, inside a workshop he'd built himself behind the house in 1971, framed with salvaged lumber from a neighbor's barn that had collapsed. He laid the concrete floor himself in stages over 2 summers. He ran electricity out to it with a friend's help in 1974. He built a workbench from an oak log that air-dried under the eaves for 3 years before he considered it ready to become a bench. Over 4 decades, Wendell built chairs and tables and cradles and dressers, not as a formal business, but for neighbors who asked for the house itself and for the quiet pleasure of the work. He bought a used bandsaw from a hickory cabinet shop in 1976. He bought a new lathe in 1982, a Delta model he considered the finest purchase of his adult life. He had hand planes in 5 sizes, chisels in 8 widths, a set of carving gouges he'd ordered from a catalog in 1985 and kept wrapped in oilcloth. He taught Odie to use nearly all of it over the years of their marriage, not because he needed the help, but because he believed, and said so often, that a person who can't make something with their own hands stays permanently dependent on whoever can. Odie enjoyed the shop, but she never thought of it as hers. She taught school all day, graded papers at night, raised 3 children, and the workshop belonged to Wendell's world, not hers. Wendell died in February 2005 at 61 of a heart attack while cutting firewood behind the barn on a cold morning. He left Odie the property free and clear, a savings account at the local bank with $31,000 in it, what remained of the cattle, and the workshop exactly as he'd used it. The lathe still had a piece of walnut mounted in the chuck. The gouges were still rolled in cloth, tied with a leather cord. Odie kept the shop closed for nearly 4 years. She'd give it a basic cleaning now and then, wipe off the dust, but she wouldn't touch the tools. In 2009, already retired more than a decade, and with her children grown and living elsewhere, she started going in there at night with no particular purpose, just to sit at the bench and look around. It was around that time that Odie became interested in a style of furniture she kept seeing in decorating magazines borrowed from the Millbrook library. Rustic pieces with natural lines, live edges, and visible knots. The kind of furniture mountain resorts in the Appalachians and vacation homes along the coast were buying from independent craftspeople for prices that impressed her. She cut pages out of those magazines and kept them in a folder in the kitchen. Then, when her youngest daughter gave her a tablet for her birthday in 2010, Odie discovered YouTube and started watching, alone, late at night, videos of woodworkers across the United States and Canada explaining how to air-dry green wood, how to stabilize bark with varnish, how to cut joints with a chisel, and handsaw without a single power tool. She also knew something most of the neighbors didn't. Her grandson Caleb had landed a job the year before at the Bellcrest Furniture Company, one of the last mid-sized furniture plants still running in the area after import competition had shut down nearly half the factories in Millbrook and the surrounding towns over the previous decade. Caleb worked in the cutting department, and one Sunday, on a visit, he mentioned offhand that the plant threw out, every single day, entire bins of walnut and cherry offcuts, pieces too crooked, too knotted, too curved, or too small for the production line, which Bellcrest paid to haul to an industrial landfill in Hickory because new county environmental rules had made open-pit burning too expensive. Odie asked, without making much of the request, if he could bring some by the next time he visited. Caleb said sure, without thinking too hard about it. It was easier to drop a load at the edge of his grandmother's farm than to pay the factory's disposal fee, and he never imagined it would turn into a 12-year routine. That's how the whole operation started. Not as an announced business plan, but as a small, almost accidental favor between a grandson and his grandmother that, without anyone noticing, was feeding a project Odie had already been designing in her head for 2 years. Odie spent the winter of 2011 and the spring of 2012 sorting the material. She separated it by diameter, by curve, by bark thickness, by whatever she could see in each piece when she held it and turned it in her hands. She built a drying shed beside the workshop out of salvaged lumber from an old chicken coop, open on the sides so air could move through, and stacked the wood with spacers between the layers, exactly the way Wendell had taught her decades earlier. In August 2012, she finished her first piece, a side table with legs made from natural walnut branches and a 2-slab live-edge top, the bark stabilized with a thin coat of varnish. She used Wendell's chisel to cut the joints, Wendell's lathe to shape the legs, and finished it with boiled linseed oil, 3 coats, applied and wiped off the way he always had. She drove the table to a craft shop in Hickory that sold locally made pieces. The owner turned it over twice, examined the joints, examined the live edge, and offered to sell it on consignment for $165, promising more if it moved fast. It sold in 9 days. Odie drove back to Hickory, collected the payment, and called Bellcrest's logistics department to ask if she could set up a standing pickup arrangement. The man on the phone said yes and sounded relieved. The plant was, by then, paying more and more to dispose of the offcuts, and having someone willing to haul them away for free solved a real problem for him. He told her she could take as much as she wanted whenever she wanted. Over the following 3 years, Odie's operation grew the way businesses grow when there's no debt propping them up. The wood cost nothing, and it would keep costing nothing, because Bellcrest saw it as savings, not charity. The workshop had been paid for 40 years earlier. The tools had been paid for across decades of careful buying by Wendell. The bandsaw needed a new blade in the fall of 2012, $16. The lathe needed a new belt in the spring of 2013, $11. She bought a set of boring bits for the joinery, $24. She bought a spoke shave for curved surfaces, $19. Linseed oil and varnish, across all of 2013, cost $52 total. By the end of 2013, total investment in tools and supplies, beyond what she'd already inherited, came to $122. That year alone, she sold 19 pieces through the Hickory shop and 6 more directly to customers who'd heard about her by word of mouth. Side tables at $165, chairs at $195 each, a rustic cradle at $340, 2 benches at $210 each, and smaller pieces ranging from $80 to $210. Combined revenue for 2012 and 2013 came to $5,940 against a material cost of $0. Caleb started to notice. On a visit near the end of 2013, he saw a row of pieces drying near the wood stove and half-jokingly asked what she was charging for a chair. When she told him, he went quiet for a moment, then said, "Grandma, this isn't a hobby. This is a real business." She told him she'd known that since before he ever brought the first load. Between 2014 and 2018, Millbrook and the surrounding towns went through a rough stretch that a lot of people in the area still remember, with a mix of anger and resignation. Competition from cheap furniture, imports out of Asia, kept squeezing the local plants, which had already been closing since the early 2000s. 2 more furniture factories in the region shut down between 2015 and 2017, and Bellcrest itself, where Caleb worked, started running reduced shifts and constant rumors of closing for good. Families that depended on factory paychecks started selling off land, falling behind on mortgages, sending their older kids off to look for work in Charlotte or Raleigh. The town lost nearly 500 industrial jobs in under 4 years. Odie watched all of this from a distance, out on the farm, with no satisfaction in it. There was nothing good about watching neighbors and former students lose what they'd built, but also without the financial panic that gripped much of the town, because the cost structure she'd built had been deliberately assembled with no leverage anywhere in it. There was no monthly payment that could turn into a crisis. There was no loan a bank could call in. Caleb, still at Bellcrest, watched his shifts shrink month by month and started helping his grandmother on weekends, first out of curiosity, then because he needed the extra money. He learned to sand, then to assemble chair frames, then to run the lathe under her supervision. In 2016, she started paying him by the hour, modest but fair by local standards. By 2017, Odie had a waiting list. The Hickory shop was selling everything she could produce and had introduced her to a gallery in Asheville and a design studio in Charlotte that served country home clients across North Carolina and Virginia. Without ever calling it a product line, she started repeating forms that had worked. The side table in 3 sizes, an armchair with a curved back she'd refined by building the same chair 11 times till the angle felt right. A dresser with handles made from natural branch forks. She hired a helper, a Millbrook woman named Marisol Tavares, in 2017 to handle sanding and finishing. In 2019, when Bellcrest permanently shut down an entire production line, Caleb lost his factory job, and Odie hired him full-time, at a fair wage funded, ironically enough, by a business built from what his own former employer used to throw away. The arrangement with Bellcrest held even as production shrank. A truck dropped off offcuts twice a month, and Odie signed a simple receipt confirming she'd taken them. It was, in the most literal sense, a company grateful to have someone haul away what it no longer had any use for. Bellcrest announced, in January 2021, that it was considering shutting down the Millbrook plant for good and moving what little production remained to a larger facility in Tennessee. The news hit the town like cold water. Those were the last 74 industrial jobs left in Millbrook, and most of the workers were over 50, with no realistic path to another job in the area. That's when Odie Ferris did something nobody in Millbrook saw coming, even though, looking back, it made perfect sense. Her business, formally registered with the state in 2018 as Ferris Handworks, was by then bringing in roughly $260,000 a year, built on reserves accumulated over almost a decade, with no debt, no rent, and no financing of any kind. When she learned through Caleb that Bellcrest was willing to sell the smaller, cutting and finishing building, the part of the plant closest to the farm, the very building that had supplied the offcuts feeding her business for a decade, for well under market value, simply to unload the property before the move to Tennessee, Odie drove to the company's regional office in Hickory, sat down across from the regional director, and made an offer in cash. The asking price was $210,000 for the smaller building, the remaining cutting equipment, and a preferred supply agreement for offcuts from whatever operations stayed in the region. After 2 meetings, Odie closed the deal at $185,000, paid in full, drawn from the savings she'd carried since her teaching days, combined with the reserves the furniture business had built up. The news spread through Millbrook faster than almost anything since the factory closure itself. The woman her grandson had filled up with junk for a decade now owned part of the plant building. It was Renee, Odie's daughter, who drove out to the farm to ask if it was true. She found her mother in the workshop, surrounded by paperwork, with Caleb beside her checking numbers on a spreadsheet. Renee asked, "Mom, you bought part of the factory?" Odie answered without looking up from the papers. "I bought the part that always paid me in wood. Seemed fair to give something back to whoever was about to lose their job there." Over the following 2 years, Odie renovated the small former Bellcrest building into a larger production space, while keeping her husband's original workshop as a space for fine finishing and training, the place where the most detailed pieces were still made by hand, on Wendell's Delta lathe, at the bench that had belonged to his own father. She rehired 4 of Bellcrest's former cutting line workers, people who'd known wood for decades and who suddenly found themselves working again in the same town under a different name, with the same hands. By the end of 2023, 12 years after that first truckload of scrap Caleb unloaded behind the barn, Ferris Handworks was bringing in $320,000 a year, with a 7-month waiting list for custom orders and sales partnerships with 6 shops and design studios across North Carolina, Virginia, and Tennessee. The material still cost essentially nothing. It now came from her own cutting operations, supplemented by arrangements with 2 smaller regional sawmills that were happy to have someone haul away what they couldn't use. In October 2023, Odie was invited to speak at a Millbrook Chamber of Commerce event about small businesses that had weathered the region's industrial decline. She hadn't planned to say much, but she accepted, because she felt there was something worth saying that nobody else in the room was likely to say. She spoke for about 8 minutes. She said she'd built a $320,000 a year business out of material a factory used to throw away, using tools her husband bought over 30 years in a workshop he built without ever borrowing a dollar. She said the key to all of it wasn't the wood or the tools or even the furniture. The key was that she'd never let the business carry a cost it couldn't survive a bad year with. She said a paid-off workshop, free material, and no debt meant her worst year was still a year where she made something, sold it, and kept the difference. And that difference, added up over 12 years, turned into a factory back in the hands of people from the town itself. Caleb sat in the audience, now the production manager at Ferris Handworks, 34 years old. After the talk, he came up to her and said, a little sheepishly, "I was just trying to save the dump fee, Grandma." She said, "I know. Sometimes the start of a good thing doesn't announce itself." He laughed. She almost smiled. Caleb's daughter, a 9-year-old named Nora, spends Saturday afternoons in the original workshop now, learning to sand corners with the same care her great-grandfather Wendell used to demand. She can't run the lathe by herself yet, but she already knows how to hold a crooked piece of cherry, turn it over in her hands, and say what she sees inside it. What most people saw when the truck dropped scrap wood at the back of that property was trash. The factory saw savings on disposal. The town saw a grandmother being taken advantage of by her own grandson. Odie Ferris saw raw material, and she also saw, without maybe being able to put it into words back then, a way to make sure that when the factory eventually closed, as it did, something would still be left in Millbrook that belonged to the people of the town itself. That's the difference between someone who sees waste and someone who sees the thing the waste doesn't know it is yet.